Welcome to the second part of American immigration, where we deal with ethnic immigration. And this is where we deal principally with the Irish, the Germans, and the Chinese. So, of course, the first of those groups are the Irish. Now, as we talked about earlier, the Irish, they would fit the bill of being Northern and Western European. The problem was, of course, that they were not Protestant. The Irish were Catholic. And so Americans would blame the Irish for all sorts of things: crime, disease, and alcohol abuse. And so periodically, as historians, we like to kind of dig in and kind of see, well, how much of that accusation really stands up and really might be true. And so, at the very least, it was the perception of many that the Irish were quite often drinking too much, that they were criminals. And so, what you had this group that, again, dominantly Catholic, not trusted to begin with, and then they come over, and this is quite often not the most skilled group of Irish citizens. And so they're coming over and they often work as servants. They often work in jobs such as building the Erie Canal, where the old saying is there's one dead Irishman for every mile of Erie Canal. And so they'd settle in cities. One of the most famous, of course, is Boston, where the Boston team name is the Boston Celtics. The Irish people are Celtic, like the Scottish as well. And so the Irish end up Boston, New York City, having large populations there. And so a lot of this discrimination that comes against them is because they're Catholic. Some of it is because some of them do also still speak the Irish language of Gaelic and not English. Now, most Irish immigrants would actually speak English by this time. And so that wasn't a thing. They had spoken it for years. But there were some who still continued to speak Gaelic. Now, what would happen is a lot of Irish, as with a lot of immigrants, they're kind of desperate. And so they're willing to work longer hours for less money. Well, that's great if you're an employer. But if you're somebody who wants to hold a job and compete against the Irish, that's forcing you to accept less money. That's forcing you to work longer hours. And that's another reason for disliking them. And so, one of the biggest reasons and one of the biggest waves of Irish immigrants comes during the potato famine. It all begins with the potato blight. Imagine that many of the Irish people were basically had become dependent upon this very cheap form of calories. The potato was one of the biggest bangs for your buck in terms of calories if you're trying to avoid starvation. And so the Irish often ate 10 pounds of potatoes a day, according to some sources. And imagine that you go and you dig one up from the ground, and when you do, you find that it's turned black, it's all mushy. And so it's this fungus that's taken over the potato. And so 1 million Irish will die in this process of starvation and disease. And another million will immigrate to the United States. 30% of Ireland's population would decrease. Now, it's good to point out at this point that people who are Irish will give you the perspective that during this time, while the Irish are starving, the English landlords were actually exporting tons of food back to England. In other words, Ireland was still growing tons of wheat and other crops and things that were growing well. And the English were not using that food to help feed these poor, starving Irish. They let them starve, according to the Irish perspective. And so just be aware that this is the source of tremendous animosity between the Irish and the English. Okay, another group that's doesn't receive the same amount of hate or frustration are the Germans. And so initially, when the Germans come, they're fairly well received. Again, Germans bring a lot of elements of culture with them. Kindergarten, okay, is a German phenomenon that they bring. Polka music, sausage, beer, sauerkraut. Okay, and in addition, they do have something called the Conestoga wagon. Now, the Conestoga wagon is what you see when you play Oregon Trail or you watch old Western movies. And so, again, you watch Texas play OU in football, OU comes out in a Conestoga wagon. It's just that old traditional kind of Western wagon that people are used to, and that does go back to German immigrants. There are some things that are debatable about what Germans may or may not have brought. One of those is that we suspect, but we can't seem to fully prove it, that basically they may be behind chicken fried steak. And so the Germans are initially well received. Now, I will tell you that that is going to change in American history. They're good during this time, but later on in American history, during World War I and World War II, the animosity towards the Germans, the frustration and anger that gets directed towards them is pretty serious. And so at this time, not many problems. They're settling in the Midwest, and so mostly well received. So here's the Conestoga wagons that you see quite often used. Okay, and here's an image of Uncle Sam being devoured by the Irish and the Chinese. And another, okay, with the Irish on the left and the Germans on the right. Okay, and the final group that we talk about are the Chinese. Okay, the first that arrive come with the California Gold Rush. Many are trying to find gold. Very few are successful, just like everybody else. Most end up establishing businesses in food and laundry, and 90% of the western portion of the Transcontinental Railroad workers end up being Chinese. We, in fact, believe that it would largely have been impossible, in many respects, to have gotten that built in as efficient and quick a way without Chinese workers. They were paid 30 to 50% less than white workers at the time, and they did jobs that were incredibly dangerous, working with TNT and dynamite and blowing up sections of the mountains so that basically trains could move through. It was not uncommon for them to try to light dynamite and then have to pull themselves up the mountain before it exploded, and sometimes not successfully. And so Chinatowns do become established in the western United States. Okay, and many cities today, okay, including Houston, still have Chinatowns. Okay, again, the look of Chinese back then was different. Okay, again, they're wearing more traditional kind of Chinese hairstyles at the time, which are very distinctive. And again, you can see the Chinese on the right. And here's a picture of Chinatown in New York City from the early 1900s. Okay, and one of the cartoons, okay, from the time, again showing that traditional Chinese style of wearing the hair back in kind of a long ponytail, for lack of a better word. And so what follows is something in U.S. history. You guys are not responsible for knowing this, but it's coming, and you'll learn it at the high school, is that by 1882 they would pass the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the Chinese Exclusion Act banned all Chinese laborers from immigrating to the United States. It prevented Chinese nationals from gaining U.S. citizenship. And it becomes permanent in 1902 and is renewed every year until 1943, when the communist Chinese become our allies in World War II. Now, they were our allies, but we didn't fully trust them. And so it wasn't until 1943 that that gets repealed. And again, you can see some more of the cartoons in terms of how they characterized Chinese. Okay, and right here you will see this reference to opium. Please be aware that when Britain controlled big parts of China, they introduced opium into China and got, I would say, about a third of the Chinese population hooked on opium. as a result, there is something in world history called the Opium Wars, where the Chinese try to fight back against the British and secure greater freedom from them. Okay, and in large part, it goes back to how the British got them hooked on opium. So many of them came here with kind of an opium habit that also made them less less trusted. And so America's railroad boom will be going on during this time. And by 1865, the U.S. has 50,000 miles of railroad, mostly in northern states. Railroads would experience huge growth after the Civil War, and over 150,000 miles of track would be laid between 1865 and 1895. The Chinese and the Irish would prove to be the primary workers. Okay, here again is 1860. You can see that most of the rail lines are located in the north. Okay, there is some rail through the south, okay, but it's nothing compared to what's going on up here. You can see that Texas has a little bit of a railway that kind of leads from Galveston into the interior. And by 1870, you can see that it's growing even more. By 1870, you can see the Transcontinental Railroad has gone over. And by 1890, you can see how much further it has grown. Okay, making the shipment of goods and people across the country much faster and much cheaper. Additionally, if you ever are to look at a map of the United States at night, you can see the path of a lot of the railways, okay, especially in the U.S. Midwest. And so again, where you really want to look is this region right here. Okay, the rail line would go straight out, okay, straight out towards the Rocky Mountains. Now, the moment they get to the mountains, they're at the mercy of the mountains, and so they can no longer go in straight lines, and you have to build them through and over things. Okay, but you can see these lights, and these are these little towns that are built along the railroads. And so, unlike any place else, that Midwest region really does show you the path of the railways quite well. And again, zooming in a little bit further, you can see it. Now, do keep in mind that if a railroad bypassed your town would quite often become a ghost town. And so we have hundreds, thousands of ghost towns in the United States. Okay, and they simply were towns that used to be around, but when they were passed by the railroad or eventually the highway, they would die out. Okay, and here we can see Texas down here. See, here's Houston. Here you can see all the oil rigs that are out here in the Gulf Coast. San Antonio, Austin, Dallas. This area right here, this is the Eagle Ford Shale. That's natural gas burning off at night. That's not a city. That's mostly not people. And so the big culminating event of the Transcontinental Railroad was when the Chinese workers on the West Coast and the Irish workers on the East Coast met up in Promontory Point, Utah on May 10th, 1869. Okay, they had 4 spikes that they drove in the ground. The most famous and the best one is the Golden Spike. They had ones that were other quality of metal. I've linked a video that you can check out if you're curious about that. It's really quick. And so you can find this basically on display at Stanford University. The first photo, you actually have the Chinese workers in. Now by the second famous photo, they had gotten the Chinese workers out of the way. And so here is the famous linking of the Transcontinental Railroad. Okay, and our final part here, nativism. Increases in Irish immigration led to the creation of a nativist party. Okay, they're originally known as the American Party, okay, but the more popular term, and the one that we use to reference them more often, is the Know Nothing Party. Because when they were asked, well, are you a member of this party, they would say, I know nothing. And so the Know Nothing Party becomes this anti-immigrant party in American history. So it's against Catholics, it favors white Protestant Christians. And so here you see, again, this cartoon where it's the Know Nothings kind of standing against the Catholics. Okay, and here is the Know Nothing flag. Okay, there is also a movie called The Gangs of New York that shows a little bit about the Know Nothings. Leonardo DiCaprio, Daniel Day-Lewis. It's a quite famous movie, and it shows also some of the first street gangs in the United States, okay, many of which were Irish. And so it gets into that in the 1840s through 60s. And so finally, okay, immigrants would end up changing America in many ways. Okay, it would fuel industrial and economic growth. Okay, they would acquire citizenship, elect politicians, and contribute their culture and traditions to American culture. Chinese, Irish, and Mexican workers would help to build railroads, and immigrants worked in coal mines, steel and textile mills, and factories. Women immigrants worked in factories as seamstresses, as laundresses, made piecework, and worked as servants. Immigrants would also help the U.S. become a world power.